It was the spring of 1945. The war in Europe was crumbling. Cities lay in ashes, flags torn, and silence replaced the thunder of artillery. Along a narrow, muddy road in western Germany, a column of weary figures trudged forward. Their grey uniforms, once symbols of authority, now clung to their shoulders like heavy chains. These were German women, clerks, nurses and auxiliaries who had served under the Reich, now prisoners of war. They expected humiliation. They expected starvation. They expected revenge. But what awaited them on the other side of that American checkpoint was something no one had prepared them for. Inside a repurposed mess hall, the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air. Butter, real butter, melted slowly over warm loaves. Steam curled from metal trays as American soldiers, their faces calm but unreadable, placed portions of soup and potatoes in front of the captured women. For a moment time froze. The women stared, unsure whether it was a cruel trick or a dream born from exhaustion. A silence spread through the hall, the kind of silence only war can create, where gratitude and disbelief share the same breath. For the first time in years, they were treated not as enemies, but as humans. It was still cold that morning, the kind of cold that crept through every layer of fabric, finding its way into bones already weakened by hunger. The war in Europe was reaching its final, brutal breaths. Roads that had once carried tanks and soldiers now carried silence and prisoners. A line of German women moved slowly along a muddy track, their boots sinking into the damp earth with every tired step. Some leaned on one another, too weak to stand. Their uniforms were torn, grey coats stained with weeks of rain and dust. A few still clutched small satchels, fragments of another life, a photo, a letter, a rosary. They didn't know where they were being taken, only that the war was over for them. And yet the word over felt hollow. For them, surrender wasn't peace, it was uncertainty. They were the defeated, the conquered, and the stories whispered among them painted a grim picture of what came next. They had heard rumors of camps, of interrogations, of revenge. The fear of what the victors might do was worse than hunger itself. As the column reached the outskirts of a small village, they saw the stars and stripes flying above a checkpoint. American soldiers stood guard, rifles slung across their shoulders, eyes sharp but calm. The German women slowed, their breath catching. Every instinct told them to brace for cruelty, humiliation perhaps worse. One woman, barely in her 20s, whispered a prayer under her breath. Another hid her face behind a scarf, ashamed of her uniform and what it represented. But the Americans did not shout. They did not jeer. They simply watched in silence, a silence filled not with hatred, but with quiet assessment. An officer raised his hand, motioning the line to stop. He said something to a young private beside him, who nodded and disappeared into a tent. A few minutes later, the women saw movement near the camp entrance. Tables being set up, metal containers steaming. The unmistakable scent of something cooking drifted through the cold air, a smell that didn't belong to war. Food. For a moment, none of them dared to believe it. Their stomachs clenched painfully at the scent, a reminder of just how long it had been since they'd eaten properly. Bread perhaps, nor coffee. Maybe it was a trick of the wind. The women looked at one another, uncertain. Then came the voice. Calm, clear, accented by a steady American tone. Bring them inside. We've got food ready. The German prisoners hesitated. A few stepped forward cautiously, eyes darting to the soldiers for any sign of mockery. None came. One of the Americans, a young man with dirt on his face and a soft expression, gestured toward the tables. He spoke again, slower this time, as if speaking to frightened children. It's all right. You're safe here. Come on, eat. The words struck harder than any weapon could. Safe. The idea seemed impossible. They were led into what had once been a schoolhouse, its windows shattered, walls patched with canvas. Inside, rows of wooden tables had been cleared and lined with metal trays. Steam rose from pots at the far end, where a few soldiers, cooks perhaps, ladled soup into tin bowls. The air smelled of potatoes, onions, and broth. It was overwhelming. One by one, the women sat down. Their hands trembled not from cold but disbelief. The Americans moved methodically, serving them portions, offering slices of coarse bread and tin mugs of coffee. Not a single harsh word was spoken. No one laughed, no one gloated. Instead, there was something that none of them had expected to find here: dignity. The women watched as an American sergeant walked slowly down the aisle, stopping now and then to refill water cups. He wasn't much older than some of them, perhaps 25, maybe younger. His uniform was worn, his expression tired, but his eyes carried something different: pity, maybe understanding. One of the German women, an older nurse with lines carved deep into her face, finally whispered, Why are you feeding us?" The sergeant paused. He looked at her for a long moment, then said simply, "Because you're people." The words hit harder than a bullet. She lowered her head, unable to respond. For years, her world had been divided into enemies and allies, right and wrong, superior and inferior. But here, in the ruins of a war that had consumed millions, that illusion shattered with a bowl of soup and a soldier's quiet humanity. Somewhere near the door, another woman, barely 19, began to cry. The sound was soft, like a whisper lost in wind. No one mocked her. In that small, dimly lit room, the tears were not of fear, but release. For the first time in years, someone had looked at them without hatred. The Americans, too, were not immune to the moment. Many of them had lost brothers, friends, perhaps family to this same enemy. Yet now, looking at these women, frail, broken, their faces drawn with exhaustion, revenge seemed meaningless. The war was over, and whatever ideology had divided them now seemed small compared to the raw sight of suffering before them. Outside, the sky was beginning to clear. Pale sunlight filtered through cracks in the window, falling across the tables. Dust floated in the air like snow. The women ate in silence, each bite a mixture of gratitude and guilt. A few whispered prayers over their food. Others simply stared at it, unsure whether they deserved it. A young American private walked past carrying a tray of bread. He noticed one woman sitting still, untouched meal before her. Her eyes were distant. He stopped, bent slightly, and asked, "You okay?" She hesitated, then shook her head. I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. The soldier looked confused for a moment, then smiled gently. "There's nothing to understand," he said. "It's over now," he walked on. But the words lingered in her mind. It's over now. For so long, over had meant loss, the loss of homeland, of pride, of everything they'd believed in. But now it meant something new, the possibility of peace, however fragile. In that hall, the smell of food mixed with the faint scent of soap and mud. Outside, crows circled above the fields, calling out in harsh tones. Inside, the women finished their meal quietly, some still unable to meet the Americans' eyes. A few soldiers collected empty dishes. One of them, wiping his hands on a cloth, said softly to another, "They don't look like monsters, do they?" The other shook his head. "No, just people caught in the wrong war." The conversation drifted away, but the sentiment stayed. Later that afternoon, as the women were led to their temporary barracks, makeshift tents lined neatly on the edge of the camp, they noticed something extraordinary. Every tent had blankets. Every prisoner received water, food, and even medical attention if needed. The camp wasn't comfortable, but it was humane, orderly, clean. The women whispered among themselves, "This cannot be real. They are showing us mercy." Why, because they won, perhaps? No, because they are different. In the evening, when the sun dipped behind the ruined village, the air turned gold. A few women stood outside their tents, looking at the horizon. They could still hear distant gunfire, echoes of battles continuing somewhere beyond. But for the first time in months, they didn't feel like prey. One of them, her hair streaked with grey, murmured, "If only we had shown the same mercy." Another nodded silently. There were no speeches, no grand gestures, only the quiet realization that something within them had shifted. They had entered the camp as prisoners of war, but they were leaving that mess hall as witnesses to something rarer than victory: compassion. That night, As the camp lights flickered and a soft wind rustled the canvas tents, a few women couldn't sleep. They lay awake, staring at the sky. Somewhere in the darkness, the scent of baked bread still lingered faintly in the air. It wasn't just food that had filled them that day, it was humanity. Years later, when the war was nothing more than memory and dust, some of those women would speak of that moment. They would tell their children and grandchildren, not of the pain or the defeat, but of that one day when the enemy treated them with dignity. And they would remember how a single act of kindness could disarm even the hardest heart, because sometimes history isn't changed by guns or generals. Sometimes it changes quietly, in the simple act of one human being offering bread to another. The moment they stepped into the dining hall, time seemed to slow. The air was warmer here, carrying the comforting smell of broth and bread. It was the first real warmth they had felt in weeks, maybe months. The windows were broken, patched with canvas that fluttered slightly with each passing breeze. Shafts of pale light filtered through, cutting across the smoke rising from the cooking pots. It was not luxury, just survival made gentle. Yet to those who had lived on fear and rations, it felt like an impossible kindness. The women sat quietly, as if afraid to make a sound. They weren't sure how to act. Their hands, still shaking from cold and exhaustion, rested on the rough wood of the tables. The benches creaked beneath their weight. Every movement seemed amplified. The scraping of boots, the soft rattle of cutlery, the faint bubbling from the kitchen corner. Even the Americans spoke in low voices, as though unwilling to break the fragile stillness that hung in the air. A soldier ladled soup into tin bowls, his sleeves rolled up, his expression steady. Beside him another sliced bread, thick pieces stacked neatly on a tray. The women watched his hands move with mechanical precision, slice, place, repeat. There was no anger in his face, no gloating, no cruelty, just duty. A kind of calm, steady duty that made the scene almost surreal. One woman near the end of the table pressed her lips together, fighting tears. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen such food, real food. She had once worked in a canteen during the war, serving officers and pilots who spoke of victory as if it were a birthright. Now she was a prisoner, staring at the same meal she used to prepare for others. But this time she was on the other side. The irony stung deep, but the hunger was stronger. The soldier approached, setting the bowl before her. Steam rose in soft curls, carrying the scent of onions and herbs. He nodded once, a simple, wordless gesture, and moved on. She looked at the bowl for a long time before daring to touch it. Her reflection wavered in the thin layer of oil floating on top. Slowly, she picked up the spoon. Around her, others did the same. The sound of spoons dipping into soup filled the room, a rhythm slow and uneven, like hesitant music. No one spoke. The first sip burned their tongues, but they didn't stop. The taste was almost too much, rich, salty, alive. Some swallowed quickly, others savored each mouthful, afraid it would vanish. Tears slipped silently down a few faces, but no one wiped them away. The act of eating had become sacred, something not to be interrupted. At another table, a young American cook watched quietly. His hair was matted with sweat and soot, his apron stained. He had served meals to soldiers in battle zones, to men returning wounded and broken, but this was different. There was something haunting about serving food to the enemy. Not soldiers, but women. Their faces looked nothing like the propaganda posters he'd grown up with. They weren't cold or monstrous. They looked human. Too human. He leaned toward another soldier beside him and whispered, "They look just like the folks back home." The other man nodded slowly. "Yeah," he murmured. "War doesn't care who you are." At the far end of the hall, one of the German women, a tall figure with cropped hair, had not touched her food. She sat straight, her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes followed every movement of the Americans, searching for a catch, a hidden trick. In her mind, kindness was a weapon, something used to lower defenses. She'd been told all her life that the enemy was cruel, godless, savage. But here they served her soup. When one soldier noticed her untouched bowl, he approached. "Something wrong, ma'am?" he asked quietly. She blinked, startled by his tone, polite, not mocking. "You feed us," she said softly. "Why?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Because you're hungry." Her mouth opened, then closed again. It was too simple an answer to believe, and yet too honest to deny. The silence deepened. In that silence, shame began to mix with gratitude. Every bite reminded them not only of their hunger, but of the things they had done or ignored during the war. Each woman carried her own ghosts, the factories, the propaganda, the uniforms. Now, stripped of power and pride, they sat as equals at a table that did not belong to them. The bread, thick and rough, was passed down the line. Fingers brushed together briefly as hands reached for it. One woman tore her piece in half and quietly slid the rest toward the woman beside her, who had none. The gesture was small, but it mattered. Mercy, it seemed, was contagious. An older woman, her hair streaked with silver, whispered to no one in particular, "It smells like my mother's kitchen." Before the war, the words drifted into the air, fragile and sad. A few others looked up, remembering their own kitchens. Tiled floors, the sound of spoons clinking in enamel pots, laughter that now seemed centuries away. The smell of bread could reach deeper into the heart than any speech. For a brief moment they were not prisoners. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, people. Outside, the late afternoon light had turned golden, filtering through the cracks in the walls. Dust particles shimmered like snowflakes in the glow. It painted everything with a quiet warmth. The soldiers' faces, the rough tables, the trembling hands that held tin cups. The sound of distant birds filtered through the broken glass. Somewhere life was moving on. A young girl, barely 18, suddenly began to cry into her soup. The sound startled those around her. One of the Americans stepped forward instinctively, unsure what to do. The girl tried to cover her face, ashamed. Between sobs, she managed to whisper, "I didn't know it could be like this. They told us." She couldn't finish. The soldier hesitated, then gently placed a folded napkin beside her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In war, words often did more harm than silence. Minutes passed like hours. The soup pots emptied. The last of the bread disappeared. The room was filled not with conversation, but with the sound of quiet breathing, human, steady, alive. For many of the women, this meal would mark the first time in years that they felt warmth without fear attached to it. A soldier near the door lit a cigarette and stood watching. He had been in France, seen the camps, seen what the war had done. He blew smoke into the fading light and muttered under his breath, "Maybe this is how it ends, not with guns, but with bread." His comrade looked at him, puzzled, but he didn't explain. Some things couldn't be put into words. The women began to finish their meals. Bowls were collected, cups stacked neatly. No one wanted to leave yet. The hall, for all its cracks and scars, had become something rare, a refuge. Even for just an hour, it was a space without hatred. A moment carved out of chaos where the war could not reach them. The young cook, now standing near the window, caught sight of a small German girl, no older than 16, staring at the empty pot. She wasn't crying, but her eyes were vacant, hollow. Without saying a word, he walked to the back, found a small scrap of bread he had saved for himself, and placed it in her hands. She looked up, eyes wide. "Danke," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just eat." The act was small, unnoticed by most, but it mattered to him, because in that one simple gesture he felt like maybe something broken could still be repaired. Not the world, perhaps, but one human heart at a time. When the women finally stood, they did so slowly. Their movements were heavy, but not with fear, with thought. They filed out of the hall into the crisp evening air. Behind them, the Americans began cleaning up, the sound of water and metal echoing softly through the building. No one spoke for a long time. Outside, the camp stretched out in quiet order. Smoke from nearby fires curled into the twilight. The women gathered near the tents assigned to them, each lost in her own silence. Some held pieces of bread in their hands, unwilling to let go. Others looked toward the American flag, fluttering gently in the wind, wondering how mercy could exist under the banner of an enemy. In one corner of the camp, an American chaplain knelt to adjust a lantern. He noticed the women watching him and gave a small nod. It wasn't a greeting, not exactly, more of an acknowledgement, the kind that says, "I see you, you exist." And for women who had been invisible for so long, that meant something. As darkness crept in, the sound of boots faded. The day was done, yet the memory of that hall, the smell of butter melting on bread, the clink of spoons, the quiet compassion, lingered like smoke in their minds. Some lay awake that night, whispering to each other in the dark. Did you see how they looked at us? Not like enemies, like people. Maybe not all of them hate us. Maybe this war really is ending. In the morning, the sun rose over the camp, casting long shadows across the tents. Life resumed its rhythm. Orders given, guards changed, meals prepared. But something had shifted inside every woman who had sat at those tables. It was small, fragile, but real, a spark of faith in the possibility of goodness. For years they had been taught that kindness was weakness, mercy a lie. But here, in the ruins of a world they helped destroy, kindness had found them anyway. And it had done what no speech, no victory parade, no political ideology could. It had made them feel human again. They would never forget the taste of that bread, nor the look in the soldier's eyes as he served it. Because sometimes, a simple meal can carry the weight of an entire war and the promise of something beyond it. Even decades later, the memory of that meal lingered in the minds of the women who had sat at those long wooden tables, tin trays in front of them, hearts pounding with disbelief. It was not the taste of bread or soup they remembered most vividly. It was the shock, the revelation that even amidst the ashes of war, human decency could persist. That fleeting hour, that single act of shared humanity, had etched itself permanently into their consciousness. For many of the women, life after the war was complicated, painful, and full of contradictions. Some returned to shattered homes where the echoes of conflict still lingered, cities flattened, families broken, livelihoods gone. Others migrated across borders, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs, the scars of captivity, and that intangible memory of mercy. Yet in every story, one moment was described again and again, the warmth of a hall where they were fed, not as enemies, but as people. The memory of American soldiers bending over trays of food, of steam rising from metal bowls, remained almost too vivid. They remembered the soft, careful movements of the men who served them, the respectful nods, the patient demeanor. It was not a display of superiority or power, but a quiet, unassuming humanity. These small gestures, a cup of water offered without question, a piece of bread passed down a line, a simple word spoken with calm certainty, lingered like a ghost in their minds. Refusing to fade, some women would later recount these experiences to their children, grandchildren, even strangers. They spoke of the war as a brutal, unforgiving force that had stripped them of control, pride, and sometimes hope. But they also spoke of that day as proof that kindness could transcend hatred, that mercy could survive even in the shadow of destruction. And in telling these stories, the act of remembering became sacred, a way to honor not just the past, but the enduring presence of goodness in humanity. One elderly woman, seated in a sunlit room decades later, traced her fingers over a faded photograph of the mess hall. Her eyes glistened with tears that had nothing to do with sorrow alone. It wasn't the food, she whispered to herself. It was that they saw us as people. For the first time, someone saw us as human, not just as enemies. The words were almost too fragile to speak aloud, yet they carried the weight of a lifetime of reflection. Across the world, other women remembered in similar ways. Some wrote diaries, their entries filled with vivid descriptions of the American soldiers' faces, the organized tables, the smell of bread and butter. Some drew sketches or painted, trying to capture the hall's warmth in colors and lines. And every single account shared a common thread: the disbelief that mercy could exist at the end of a war, that generosity could emerge from the very forces that had caused so much suffering. Time did not diminish the power of that memory. If anything, it strengthened it. The women who survived the war often remarked that no enemy could ever harm them again in the way the war had, because in that mess hall they had witnessed a force stronger than fear or hatred. It was subtle, quiet, but undeniable. The recognition that people could choose compassion over cruelty, dignity over revenge. Some would recall that night with vivid sensory detail. The faint creak of the benches, the soft clinking of spoons against tin, the warmth that spread slowly from the bowls to their cold hands. The way the light fell through the patched windows, casting long, comforting shadows across the room. They remembered the hushed voices, the pauses between bites, and even the distant birdsong filtering through broken glass. These memories became almost cinematic in their minds, a living tableau of mercy in a landscape defined by violence. As years passed, the story of that day took on layers of meaning. In their own lives, some women chose paths of kindness, inspired by what they had received. They cared for neighbors, helped strangers, and taught younger generations that even in the darkest times, choices could be made that elevated humanity. They carried the lesson that war might strip you of safety, of home, of pride, but it could never take away the memory of mercy, the knowledge that people could be seen and treated as human beings. The memory also shaped their understanding of history itself. While history books often focus on battles, strategies, and statistics, these women understood the importance of small, quiet acts, the moments that do not make headlines but define the human experience. For them, that day in the mess hall was as significant as any major event. It proved that within the machinery of war, individual actions still had weight, still had the power to heal and transform. When they returned to Germany or moved elsewhere, they often told themselves that if nothing else survived, this memory would. And it did. In conversations with grandchildren, in letters, in reflective moments by the fireside, they would recount the sight of American soldiers serving food with quiet dignity and the sensation of warmth spreading through their exhausted bodies. They would remember the looks shared between women seated side by side, strangers united in disbelief, in hope, and in the fragile joy of being seen. Many women confessed that it was not only the act of being fed, but the attitude behind it that stayed with them. There was no condescension, no expectation of gratitude beyond acceptance, no triumph in power. Just the simple, unwavering understanding that these women, these former enemies, deserved to be treated with humanity. It was this recognition, more than the soup or the bread, that lodged in their hearts and refused to leave. Even the sensory details of that meal were etched deeply. The smell of butter melting over warm bread, the faint tang of freshly cooked vegetables, the sound of quiet conversation punctuated by the distant shuffle of boots. Each detail acted as a mnemonic, a tiny thread connecting the present to the past. In moments of despair, recalling the hall brought solace. In moments of gratitude, it reminded them that goodness could exist even where destruction had reigned. The memory was also deeply emotional. Many women admitted to feeling guilt alongside gratitude. Guilt for the war, for the suffering they had witnessed or facilitated, and gratitude for the simple fact that someone had treated them with dignity. These conflicting emotions were inseparable, intertwined like two strands of a single rope. And in their hearts, they carried the lesson that acknowledgement and empathy could exist even for those who had once been adversaries. Some of the women returned to the site years later, after peace had settled over Europe. The mess hall had long been repurposed, its windows repaired, walls painted, tables replaced. Yet the echo of that day seemed to linger, as if the walls themselves remembered the acts of kindness that had occurred within them. Walking through the space, these survivors described a strange sensation, the past pressing softly against the present, reminding them that some memories are too vital to fade. In telling this story repeatedly, they came to realize that the memory was not only theirs to hold, but to share. It became a lesson, a parable of mercy, a quiet protest against the notion that enemies must always be dehumanized. They reminded each other, and anyone who would listen, that compassion can flourish even amidst destruction, that humanity is never fully lost, even when it seems overwhelmed by cruelty. This memory also shaped their understanding of themselves. They were no longer simply women who had been prisoners of war. They were witnesses to mercy, carriers of a story that defied conventional narratives of triumph and defeat. They were proof that history is not just made in victories and losses, but in small, profound acts of human decency that ripple across time. As the years turned into decades, and faces aged and hair grayed, the memory never diminished. Some would close their eyes and imagine the tables, the bread, the steam rising in soft curls. Some would even recall the quiet pride and composure of the American soldiers, whose presence had been firm but not harsh, attentive but not intrusive. For these women, the act of remembering became an act of survival, a source of strength that no war could take away. Even when recounting it, they would pause, searching for words that could capture the complexity of the moment: fear, relief, awe, gratitude, guilt, all woven together in a tapestry that transcended language. And in every retelling, whether to family, historians or strangers, the core remained. That day, in that hall, they were treated as humans first, enemies second, decades after the war. When the world had moved on, and the scars of Europe had begun to heal, the story of that mess hall continued to resonate. It was told and retold, not as a tale of conquest or victory, but as a quiet, enduring testament to the power of empathy. And in telling it, they ensured that the memory did not belong to the past alone, but lived on, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, light could be found, sometimes in the simplest of gestures: a bowl of soup, a piece of bread, and the unspoken acknowledgement that even an enemy deserves dignity.